Okay. Looks good. Yes. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Very good. Welcome back. Welcome also to all of you watching this online. Our satsang continues. And as always, we'll take questions both from our online students and from our local students. First question today from we had an email last week from Prashanto, who lives in Bangladesh. We had a nice discussion about that. We have another question from him. He asks a question regarding scriptures like Ramayana, Mahabharata, Puranas. In Ramayana in particular, there is an event that Hanuman, flying up in the sky, swallowed the sun. In fact, months ago, we had this discussion. Somebody brought up the Hanuman Chalisa, and one of the verses describes this incident in the Ramayana. And flying with a mountain in his hand. Remember, he wanted to get that Sanjeevani. He couldn't figure out which plant it was. What was his solution? You get it. Okay, these stories. So, but Prashanto's questions is, despite having such profound devotion in gods and goddesses and scriptures, how can a scientific mind takes such occurrences? I think he's having such profound I think he's referring to me, as an example of someone who has. And I've mentioned before, I have a very rich devotional practice, and devotional practices are often associated with deities like Hanuman. Hanuman doesn't happen to be my Vishishtadvaita, but there'd be nothing wrong with choosing Hanumanji as my Vishishtadvaita. Suppose I did. Suppose Hanumanji was my Ishta. And suppose I'm reciting Hanuman Chalisa, and I come to that verse. I don't know the Chalisa well enough. Some of you do and could probably recite that verse. Anyway, so I come to that verse where he flies up. He was a child, and he thought the sun looked like a fruit, and so he goes and he eats the sun. If Hanumanji is my Vishishtadvaita, how would I relate to that? I would take it as a story. A story. And stories are, the common word we would use is mythology. And a lot of Orthodox Hindus are prickly about calling these things mythology. And I definitely understand. If you were to ask, are the stories in scriptures myths, or is there any historical accuracy? Depends on who you ask. If you ask a very orthodox teacher of Hindu scripture, that orthodox Hindu might say, this actually happened. When Hanumanji was young, he flew up in the sky and he ate the sun. Of course, if we were to ask him, after he ate the sun, did it get dark? I mean, the story is problematic for a number of reasons, not just the necessity for the sun. But this Orthodox person would say, yes, it actually happened. And I think it's important for us all, and especially for me as a teacher, to respect such orthodox scholars. We don't have to agree with their point of view, that these stories are historical records, but doesn't mean we should denigrate, oh, what a silly story. That's not necessary to bring in any kind of negativity. On the other hand, if we understand a little bit better, this orthodox scholar, do they actually know for a fact that Hanumanji carried the mountain and ate the sun? They don't know for a fact. It comes in scripture. And they have andha vishwasa, blind faith. And this word andha is important because it demonstrates the lack of reasonableness. To me, this is a distinction. I don't know if you've thought about it. There's two kinds of beliefs: reasonable beliefs and unreasonable beliefs. The entire doctrine of karma is a reasonable belief. It's not a scientifically provable fact. But it's based on vishwasa, but not andha vishwasa. It's a reasonable belief. We have lots of reasoning to support the doctrine of karma. On the other hand, Hanumanji carrying a mountain as he flies through the sky would be an example of, or better yet, eating the sun would be an example of an unreasonable belief. They're both beliefs. We're not saying one is better than the other, but they're very different, right? Difference between a reasonable belief and an unreasonable belief. So one who accepts a reasonable belief is a reasonable person. I consider myself a reasonable person. One who accepts an unreasonable belief is not a reasonable person by definition, and that's the case where we would call it andha vishwasa, blind faith. So we can take this lens and apply it to our whole body of scriptures. Our scriptures have many beliefs are described. There's nothing wrong in discerning the difference between a reasonable belief and an unreasonable belief. And where you draw the line is up to you. And wherever you draw the line between reasonable and unreasonable, it's fine with me. Why should anyone object? If you want to accept the historicity of Hanumanji eating the sun, by the way, do you think that took place on a Tuesday afternoon or a Thursday morning? Just to make the point of that many stories are not necessarily historical events. Okay, enough said. Then, Maya, who lives in Singapore, this is an interesting question. Swamiji, why doesn't conscience, not consciousness, she uses the word conscience, why doesn't conscience prick even a bit the wrongdoers? Why doesn't their conscience stop them from doing hurtful acts? You might say, Swami Tadatmananda might say it's due to their ignorance and desires, as I've said many times. But isn't it still the divinity within, which is present there, the basis there, everywhere, even present in the wrongdoers? So the wrongdoers, those who commit acts of adharma, we'll say harmful deeds. Those who commit harmful deeds are many, and they are equally divine, right? Ishvara is equally present in the saint and sinner. Even Sri Krishna says that in the Bhagavad Gita. So apparently there's no contradiction between being a manifestation of divinity and committing acts of adharma. And so Maya is pointing to this problem. How can it be that a manifestation of Sri Krishna, like you or me, manifestation of Ishvara, let us say, How can that manifestation, that divinity, commit acts of adharma? And Maya here suggests that they should have some kind of conscience. Now, please don't confuse conscience, and Maya understands here, so she hasn't made this confusion. But sometimes conscience and consciousness get confused. So consciousness is what we talk about all the time in Advaita Vedanta. Conscience could be defined as your inborn sense of right and wrong, your felt sense of right and wrong. And it's a natural part of the mind. We all have a conscience. And conscience has nothing to do with that divinity, right? So if someone had no conscience, if that's even possible, if someone had no conscience, they would still be divine in essence, because it's that consciousness that is the divinity. Conscience, we would say, is a faculty of the mind, and mind can be whatever it is and doesn't detract from the essential divinity of Satchidananda Atma. So now the question goes into the realm of psychology, so we'll just keep it short. Does your conscience, your felt sense of right or wrong, how did it get there? Were you born with conscience according to developmental psychology? No. We developed conscience. How do we develop conscience? From our role models. So whatever, when mom said, don't do that. By the way, if you ever have that, you're about to do something, you hear a voice, don't do that. Whose voice is it? Usually. Mom's voice. Don't do that. So according to developmental psychology, conscience is a mental faculty that is developed in children due to the influence of their role models, especially parents. Suppose I gave this very grim example. Suppose you grew up in a very rough situation, you never met your father, and your mother is addicted to crack cocaine. Growing up in that situation, what kind of conscience do you think you would develop? You would still have a conscience, but wouldn't that conscience be very different from yours and mine because of the developmental circumstances? So I think this is how we can understand that someone who commits horrible deeds, they have a conscience, but not like your conscience and my conscience. And more importantly, they are equally divine. And this brings us back to our Vedantic observation, and that is harmful deeds are done due to ignorance of your true self. And the reason we say that is, if you knew that you are Satchidananda Atma, full, complete, boundaryless, infinite, what would drive you to hurt someone else? If you were enlightened, what could compel you to hurt another? Therefore, for this reason, in fact, even Swami Vivekananda was famous for saying, let's see if I can get his exact quote. There is no, I think this is pretty close, there is no such thing as evil in the world other than ignorance. I think that's pretty close to an exact quote of Vivekananda. There is no such thing as evil. Hinduism doesn't have. Is there any Satan, shaitan, in Hindu tradition? Not there. So instead of evil, we understand bad, harmful deeds are done not due to a force of evil, but rather due to ignorance. Another question here. This is from Arun, who lives in Bangalore. in the Anapana practice of vipassana. Anapana, it's breath, observing your breath, basically. Just observe the inhale, observe the exhale. It's a very common technique. We practice it a lot in the Hindu tradition. It's a practice in yoga. We call it prana vikshana. They call it anapana. I think their pronunciation is Pali. Anapana. Ana and apana. So inhalation and exhalation. This is the Pali word. In this practice, in vipassana, we are required to watch the movement of the breath. I understand that the breath and pranas are related to the mind, and also related to Kriya Shakti. My question is that being aware of the my question is, what is it that is aware of the breath? If you're observing the breath, who is the observer? And also, does this practice help in any way in achieving Atma Jnana, enlightenment, self-knowledge, or is it only an effective tool for mano nigraha, controlling the mind? And I'll take, I'm glad to have Arun's question, but I'll take exception to your use of the word only, an effective tool. To control the mind is not easy. It's a big job. We need all the tools we can get. We need all the help we can get. And this prana vikshana, or the anapana of the Buddhist tradition, is a powerful and effective way. So without doubt, it is extremely useful as a meditation technique to observe your breath. Many times here on Saturday mornings, we have practiced prana vikshana. And the difference here between prana vikshana, just to recall this important point, there's a huge difference between prana vikshana and pranayama. Pranayama is the ayama, ayamana, the control of the breath. In prana vikshana, or this anapana technique, there's no control of the breath at all. You just breathe naturally. You don't alter the rhythm of breathing or the depth of breathing or frequency of breathing. You don't alter it at all. It simply is a matter of observing the breath. Now the question here is this a useful technique for spiritual growth in a Vedantic sense? So in a Buddhist context, it's definitely used for mano vigraha, to quiet the mind. And in a Vedantic text, it can also be used for mano vigraha. Who doesn't need to control their mind? Whether you are practicing Buddhism or Vedanta, or whether you're a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim, we all need, or an atheist, we all need control over our minds. So that's a universal need. I think Arun's question is, can this practice be useful for Atma vichara? The main practice of Advaita Vedanta is self-inquiry. Can it be helpful? Yes. And it's exactly as you suggested. If you inquire who is observing the breath, that's very Vedantic. That's perfect. Of course, when it's taught, for example, Vipassana is often taught in a 10-day course. This Sri Goenka created this syllabus. It was very popular, these 10-day retreats. In the 10-day retreats, as far as I know, it's never suggested that you should inquire who is watching the breath. I presume, I've never attended a 10-day retreat, but I presume it's not included because that's not part of their tradition. That's not how Vipassana is practiced. So if you attend a 10-day retreat and spend a lot of time observing your breath, then there's no Atma vichara going on. There's no self-inquiry, in which case it'll help for mano nigraha, controlling your mind, but won't help with Atma vichara, self-inquiry. But as you're watching your breath, if you ask yourself, who is watching the breath? And if you inquire into that question, who is watching the breath, using the teachings of Vedanta, that is wonderful. That is Atma Vichara. That's another level of use of this technique. And it's far more than merely controlling your mind. But in order to do that, you have to study Vedanta first. You can't just sit down and just say, if you sit down and suppose you've never heard any Vedanta at all, and somebody says, oh, you should inquire who is observing the breath. And having not had any exposure to Vedanta at all, you start observing the breath, and then you ask your question, who is observing the breath? Your answer could only be, I am. And you get stuck right there. I am observing the breath. There's so much more to inquire into, but in order for that inquiry to take place, you need to first go through properly these teachings of Vedanta. Then that inquiry, who is watching the breath, becomes meaningful. Next question from Vic. Vic lives in England, Leeds, West Yorkshire. Yorkshire? How would some British pronounce it? Yorkshire? Okay. In New Jersey, it becomes West Yorkshire. How's that? Accents are fun. Okay. Vic says, 10 years ago I met Swami Yogeshwarananda Giri, who was a teacher of Advaita Vedanta. In one of his discourses, in later years, he spoke on the eternal now. The eternal now. Could you please say something more about this spiritual understanding? Well, I've never met Swami Yogeshwarananda, and I don't know exactly what he teaches. We could certainly look at what that statement means, the eternal now. Have you ever heard a traditional teacher of Advaita Vedanta use that particular expression? I've never used that particular expression. And to my knowledge, no traditional teacher. Shankaracharya, of course, in Sanskrit, eternal now, what would that be? Ananta Kshana. Now, that's probably pretty close. Ananta Kshana, an eternal moment. The word now in Sanskrit is an adverb, and you can't make a compound with an adverb like that. So instead of using a word for now, you would have to no. Yeah, it doesn't. I think this ananta kshana moment, meaning a present moment. Ananta kshana would come close. You won't find any expression like that in the in Shankara's works. Sounds a little. You might find something similar to that in some Buddhist texts, but definitely not in Advaita Vedanta. However, to some of you, does that sound a little familiar in a Western context? The eternal now, have you ever heard a lecture by Eckhart Tolle? This is his thing. And his thing, it's kind of falls into the category of Neo-Vedanta, which means it includes some of the teachings of Neo-Vedanta, but without all the methodology, in a very unconventional and non-traditional way. And Tolle's point would be, in the present moment, there's no suffering. in an instant. In order to suffer, you have to, I'm smiling and remember my guru's expression. In order to suffer, you have to think. You have to think how? Oh, I'm so miserable. Now, look at that. To make that thought, oh, I'm so miserable, take some time. In an instantaneous moment, can you form the thought, oh, I'm so miserable? You can't fit it into that instantaneous moment. And this is a little bit like Tolle might teach it. So in that instantaneous moment, there is no suffering. Of course, here we're not talking about instantaneous, we're talking about eternal now. So maybe Tolle doesn't talk, maybe what Tolle is teaching is quite different from this eternal now. To an Advaita Vedanta, in fact, even to a philosopher, this expression is problematic, eternal now. And this is just a little bit of logic. By the way, I have no doubt that this, I shouldn't say I have no doubt, let me put it like this. If Swami Yogeshwarananda Giri was properly taught, then he would explain the expression, the eternal now, in a manner consistent with the tradition. Even though it's not a traditional expression, if he is traditionally trained, he can explain it in a way that would make sense in Advaita Vedanta. But as I said, I don't know how he uses that expression. I don't use the expression, Shankara doesn't use the expression, no traditional teacher of Advaita Vedanta uses that expression, I think for this reason. The word is an oxymoron, and here's why. Self-contradictory. Now is an expression of a moment in time. The word eternal, properly understood, means timeless. Now, here's the thing. Eternal often means to us a really long time. My guru liked to give an example bad joke, he said, styrofoam is eternal. You put it in the landfill, and 1,000 years from now, it's still there. Good point. Of course, it's not eternal, but he was making fun of the fact that we often think of the word eternal in terms of a really long period of time, but that's not proper understanding. The word ananta, endless, anadi, beginningless. We're not talking about a length of time. We're talking about something which is timeless. And just to, this concept of what is timeless. Just to give an example, this pot. This pot weighs several ounces. Let's say 3 ounces. How long does 3 ounces exist? I'm not talking about the pot. I'm talking about weight. For how long does 3 ounces exist? This is dealing with measurement. In modern Western thought, we have these 4 dimensions, right? Up, down, left, right, front and back, and the 4th dimension being time. But these 4 dimensions are mutually exclusive. Width, how deep is it? How high is it? How long does it exist? Or take a second of time. How tall is it? How wide is it? See, when we use words referring to dimensions, they're all mutually exclusive. The word now refers to a unit of time, an instantaneously small moment of time. Remember a math class where a teacher told you that a point on a line is infinitesimally small? A point, the concept of a point in math. A point has no dimension. It has location without dimension. This is mathematics. That now is equivalent to a point. It has no dimension, none of the four. It has no width, it has no time. It's not a span of time, but it's a reference to time. And sorry, I'm really going on. Why am I talking about this in so much detail? Sorry. Let me finish. This is way too much detail. I just get off on these tangents because maybe I'm trained a lot in this tradition using a lot of logic, and I think this is a little bit over the top. So very simply, now is a reference to time. Eternal is a reference to that which is timeless. So the expression eternal now means timeless time. Huh? That's why I suggested it's an oxymoron. And because of that, I think that's the reason no traditional teacher would use it. It's not that meaningful. But I have a feeling that Swami Yogeshwarananda Giri used it in a meaningful way. I'm not criticizing the Swami, but the term is problematic. Okay, we'll take another question here, and then we'll see if any of you have questions. This question comes from Neil, who lives in North Carolina. In Upadesha Sahasri, we see many instances where Shankaracharya powerfully refutes many Buddhist arguments. Correct. However, there's no denying that ardent practitioners of Buddhism do reach enlightenment, we presume. There's no denying, he says, but I think that's a little strong. We presume that Buddhists can reach enlightenment. We empirically see great Buddhist masters like Thich Nhat Hanh, among others, who was a Vietnamese monk, he's no more, who ostensibly have led exemplary lives worthy of emulation and who were presumably enlightened. Okay. So, if there are many Buddhists who became enlightened, possible, why does a great master like Shankara criticize and dismiss the Buddhist path? And here Neil's point is, isn't such divisive language harmful rather than helpful? Can't we respectfully learn from other traditions, see other viewpoints, and grow in our understanding without engaging in such spiritual divisiveness? So to answer that question, we have to understand Shankara. Because it's Shankara who is dismissing Buddhism. I don't sit here and say Buddhism is trash. So I'm not dismissing Buddhism. Shankara is dismissing Buddhism. From a modern or postmodern point of view, it sounds divisive and maybe unnecessarily so I can understand why Neil is pointing this out. But we need to understand it from Shankara's standpoint, 800 years ago, and the form of Buddhism practiced at Shankara's time was this Madhyamika Buddhism, which was highly scholarly. Extremely scholarly. This is following the age of Nagarjuna and these other great geniuses who wrote the very important texts. By the way, those texts, by the way, are all in Sanskrit. It's nice because I can read them. I read them and honestly, I don't enjoy them. They don't work. I have read Nagarjuna and some other things. It just doesn't work for me at all. I'll come back to why that's probably so in just a moment. Actually, we're going to take it up right here in this context. So, first of all, Shankara was highly critical of Buddhists living in his time and before. Is Shankara going to be critical of Thich Nhat Hanh? a Vietnamese monk born maybe in the 1950s. Obviously not. So Shankara was critical of Buddhists he knew, and Buddhists he knew, and he probably personally, we can guess that he personally interacted with Buddhist scholars. There's no reason to doubt that. We don't have any historical records, but I think it would be reasonable to assume a great scholar like Shankara would be interested in not just studying these Buddhist scriptures, but also meeting living Buddhists. From Shankara's writings, we can assume, and this is an assumption, but I think it's a fair assumption, I think Shankara never met an enlightened Buddhist. If he had met enlightened Buddhists, do you think he might have mentioned that someplace? He would have. So it's clear Shankara never met an enlightened Buddhist, and the Buddhists he did meet were highly scholarly, because that was the Madhyamaka tradition in India at that time. Buddhism has gone through a lot of evolution. So the evolution of Buddhism then was lots of logic, lots of reasoning. And you can all appreciate that lots of logic and reasoning are not going to make you enlightened. You've also heard this observation I've made and many teachers make, and that is Buddhism differs so much from all other Hindu traditions. I shouldn't say other. Buddhism differs from Hinduism in one giant way, and that is Buddhism rejected Hindu scripture. That's it. The reason that Buddhism is considered non-Hindu is precisely because Buddhists don't accept the validity of Vedic scriptures and the scriptures that followed. Now, in those Vedic scriptures are the Upanishads. In the Upanishads are the revelations of the great rishis, which evolved into the teachings of Advaita Vedanta that we study today. So everything that we study in the name of Advaita Vedanta is based on, and many of you have heard this discussion, based on three foundations, Shruti, Yukti, Anubhava. Anubhava is experience, Yukti is reasoning, and Shruti is scripture. So everything taught in Advaita Vedanta has this threefold foundation. Everything taught has to be consistent with Shruti, scripture, Yukti, reasoning, and Anubhava, experience. Only if a teaching is consistent with all three, only then can it be accepted. But going back to Buddhism, we said Buddhism doesn't accept scripture. So therefore, Buddhism is based only on Anubhava and Yukti, experience and logic. And what we would say is that's not enough. So this is the general perspective of Advaita Vedanta on the Buddhist tradition, that its foundation is defective. And its foundation is defective because experience and reasoning is not enough. Without the revelation of the enlightened sages, you're missing the third part of the foundation. And that is why Shankara why did Shankara criticize Buddhism so much? Because it wouldn't lead you to moksha. Second reason, though, and that is, there are places where Shankara, like, I don't want to put myself on a level of Shankara, but just like I go on and on and on, some places unnecessarily, Shankara also goes on and on and on, and it seems excessive. And some of his criticism of Buddhism might seem excessive. Why? because he's not teaching Buddhists. He's not arguing with Buddhists. When Shankara, this is just interesting, you may not ever have considered this. When Shankara is dismissing Buddhism in his commentaries, who is he addressing? He's not addressing Buddhists, right? That's really important to know. He's addressing us. So then why is he, and by the way, I presume none of us are that inclined towards Buddhism. So if the readers of his commentaries were not inclined so much towards Buddhism, then why does he go into such great detail? It's a logical exercise called manana. A very important part of Advaita Vedanta, the practice of introducing other schools of thought, considering them, analyzing them through the lens of Vedanta and finding where their weaknesses are. You raise doubts and dismiss them. This is a process called manana. It's often compared to, and Shankara himself gives this metaphor, and this will describe why he is so elaborate in his arguments against Buddhism. The metaphor he himself gives us, if you are, in his time, there was a lot of people were raising cows. You don't want your cows to run away, so you have a fence to hold them in. And if you're putting poles in the ground to make your fence, you dig a hole, you put the pole in, you put the dirt back in, and if you push on the pole, what happens? The post, I should call it. If you push on that fence post, it'll go right over. That's not strong. Of course, in modern times, we pour concrete and iron and steel and different things. But assuming they didn't have concrete. So what would they do? They would put the pole in the ground and then wiggle it. And when you wiggle it, then you create some space, you put more earth in, pound it down, wiggle the post some more, put more earth in, wiggle it some more, and put more earth in and wiggle it, put more earth in and wiggle it. In this process, that post becomes more and more stable. That's Shankara's own description of how this process of manana works. So he introduces Buddhism very elaborately for the sake of manana, for the sake of making our understanding unshakable, very firm. That's the idea. Okay, do we have questions here? We'll start here.
Swamiji, how would you respond to the... I see a potential contradiction just based off her definition of reality as being unchanging. And then we describe Atma as limitless. Mm-hmm. Is there any contradiction there where you're putting a limit on something, in a sense, by calling it unchangeable?
Doesn't unchangeable remove limits? It's a negative word, right? Unchangeable means you're removing the quality of change. Doesn't that mean free from an attribute, like limitless?
But wouldn't, in a sense, limitless necessarily allow for the opposite to be true as well? Can something be?
Can you give an example? Because I'm not getting anything.
To call something limitless, infinite, boundless,
which means free from attributes of which create limitations. So to be more accurate, why don't we say free from attributes? Now continue with your question with this. If we substitute free from attributes, limitation is an attribute, right? Limit, correct. An edge, boundary. Something is there creating a limitation. Thank you. Something is there creating a limitation. So to be more precise in our thinking, suppose we replace the word limitless with attributeless. Now reconsider your question and rephrase your question. But instead of using the word limitless, use the word attributeless. Go ahead and try to restate your question. Just substitute attributeless for limitless.
Well, if I do so, then
the problem is solved.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's tricky because this logic of negation is used so extensively in this tradition, and we have to learn to be comfortable with that logic of negation. It's not typical. In our day-to-day lives, in fact, if we use, it's complicated. And we often use negation in our day-to-day lives in incorrect ways. Let me not get it. I'm going to go off on another logical spin-off. I won't do that. Anyway, does that address your question?
Yeah, it's
so,
more clear from that.
So limitless, boundaryless, all of these words aren't describing an entity. They don't describe an entity by telling you what it is. They tell you what it isn't. That's real different. Instead of telling you what it is, it's telling you what it isn't. Do you have a follow-up question? Go ahead.
Yeah, just to be clear with that point, looking at it from that perspective, when we say something is unchanging, and to call that then absolutely real, like you had said, we are actually removing limits instead of applying a limit of being bound by some conditions.
So unchanging is another example. We're not saying what it is, we're saying what it isn't.
Right. Understood.
So
it's my question was just from the wrong perspective.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Understood.
So this is how Vedanta works. How can you say what is Brahman? When you start off by when the Upanishad itself saying Brahman is beyond words and thoughts, then what word or thought are you going to use to describe Brahman? We start off by saying you can't do it. So then how can we use words and thoughts? Words and thoughts can't define Brahman, reality, absolute reality. Words and thoughts can't define that reality in a positive way. However, we use lots of words and thoughts in a negative way to know what Brahman is not. And then you might say, well, how does that lead us to absolute knowledge? If absolute knowledge were a thing floating around in the world, it would be useless. Negation. You can't define a thing through negation. You can't define a pot through negation. Try it. Well, what is a pot? Using only negation. It's not a chair, it's not a house, it's not the sun, it's not the moon. When will that process of negation finally culminate in the definition of a pot? Never. So if Brahman were a thing, it could not be known through mere negation. What Vedanta says is Brahman is the fundamental reality because of which you exist. It's your own essence. And since it exists as you, and it is here now, it is present in your experience in a positive way, not as an object, but present in your experience. It's the source of experience. And since Brahman is already here now as you, it's not an object like a pot, it's you, and therefore a definition by negation works for Brahman, since you already are that, as Mahavakya Tattvam says. Another question here. You'll need the microphone.
Thank you, Swamiji. I'm struggling with knowledge and belief. So, 1 + 1 = 2 seems like knowledge which everybody agrees with. And yet, from the same scriptures, we have different views, Dvaita, Vishishtadvaita, and Advaita. So do we think about these as theories? Do we think or beliefs? So I'm confused about theory, belief, hypothesis, fact, and knowledge in this context.
Okay, these are two really different questions, right? So one is about Vishishtadvaita. So which do you want to address? Do you want to address Vishishtadvaita and Dvaita with regard to Advaita, or do you want to address what is the difference between theory? Choose one or the other, please.
Either one. I'm confused.
Okay.
If knowledge shouldn't knowledge be incontrovertible, and they seem to be contradicting each other?
Okay, so let's set them aside, at least for the time being, and start with what is knowledge, what is belief. And this is the subject matter that's called epistemology. Epistemology is the study of language, study of knowledge, more particularly the study of how we get knowledge. And Vedantic, in fact, I think all epistemologies will say that, which means there are Western schools of epistemology. And in ancient India, there were several different approaches to this topic of epistemology. How do we get knowledge? And the way they all approach it is the same, both in West and in India, and that is epistemology. Knowledge comes from a source of knowledge, which is to say that jnanam, knowledge, comes, or we'll use the feminine term prama, means knowledge. Prama, knowledge, comes from a pramanam, an instrument of knowledge. So based on the particular instrument of knowledge, pramanam, you gain some kind of prama knowledge. And then we can start with, say, our senses. So from our eyes are a pramana for form, color, etc. Our ears are a pramana for sound, and so forth. We can go through all five senses. So our five senses are considered to be pramanas, sources of knowledge. Then we take it a step further, and that is when you see smoke rising from a mountainside, you say there's fire. You don't see the fire. You only see the smoke. So this is another pramana being used called inference. Anumana in Sanskrit. Anumana is a particular means of knowledge where we start with an observation, like the smoke, and because we know these fancy words, invariable concomitants. How's that? That's the word used in logic, in epistemology. Basically, it means wherever there's smoke, there's fire. So therefore, if you see smoke, you infer the presence of fire. Now things get a lot more complicated. And actually, let me give you one more. And that is, we'll call it aptavakya, the statement of a knowledgeable person. A person was walking around a mountain, and then at a later time and place, the person says there was a fire on that mountain. So that would be aptavakya, the statement of a person. So you could know about the fire without seeing it, without inferring it. You could learn about it from a third person who personally knew the fire, aptavakya. So to simplify it, Vedanta actually takes up 6 different pramanas. We're going to reduce it to 3 for the sake of our discussion. Things get a lot more complicated when you consider that pramanas can be defective. For example, if you have jaundice, everything looks yellow. It's not yellow. But the yellowness, and this is a traditional example they give, the yellowness of what you see comes about not because it exists, but because of a defect in the pramana in the eye. So that's a case of a pramana giving defective knowledge. So a pramana that is not defective gives true knowledge. A pramana that is defective gives defective knowledge, untrue knowledge. Same is true for anumana. There's a huge part of epistemology is on hetu abhasa. So wherever there's smoke, there's fire is this concomitant, invariable concomitance. And there are so many false cases of that. Well, a good false case. Let's set the complication aside. Simply put, how are you sure it's smoke and not haze or fog or dust? So an inference can also be defective. A non-defective inference gives you correct knowledge. A defective inference gives you defective knowledge. Same for aptavakya. If a person has an agenda to tell you a lie, then that person can tell you anything in the world. So the validity of any knowledge depends on the lack of defects in the thing. So what that basically boils down to is all knowledge can be defective. But what is truly knowledge, and you yourself correctly said, what is truly knowledge is that which is non-negatable. How do you know it's non-negatable? We test it. We test it using other pramanas, and we test it especially using logic. So maybe let me pause here, and why don't you like to follow up at this point? This would be a good point.
So across the different views of Dvaita, Vishishtadvaita and Advaita, is there anything that's common and non-negatable?
Is there anything that's common and non-negatable in these three traditions? They all accept a fundamental reality. They call that fundamental reality differently. So in Advaita Vedanta, we call the fundamental reality Brahman. In Vishishtadvaita, it'll be called Sriman Narayana. In Vishishtadvaita. In Dvaita, it could be called also Narayana or Krishna, depending on the sub-sect of that. So they use different names to label that fundamental reality. But then as they go on, then the way they explain that fundamental reality will be very different. It's important to say, though, that these three traditions gain their authoritativeness, a complicated topic, their ability, their non-defective nature. All three traditions point to a fundamental reality, and that fundamental reality is a non-negatable truth. And the reason these three traditions can point to that non-negatable truth is these three traditions come from aptavakya. So now we have to say, through what means do they gain that knowledge? Can you perceive with your senses an absolute reality? No, your senses are useless. Can you infer? Can you use anumana, inference, to establish that fundamental reality? No, because as the example in the smoke on the mountain, you start with perception and then infer. So you can't infer Brahman based on any perception. There's no link that allows you to make that. So therefore, I gave the example called Aptavakya, which means a statement of a knowledgeable person. In this case, the knowledgeable persons are the rishis whose statements are found in the Upanishads. So all three traditions will interpret the Upanishads in different ways, but the Upanishads reveal that fundamental reality, which is then accepted by all three traditions and then explained in different ways. Does that work for you? Okay, a complicated topic. Let me just take one or two more questions and then we'll conclude for today. Let me see. Okay, we'll end with this question. This comes from Rajiv, who lives in Pune. Nice. Rajiv asks, I am a householder with a job and family, and I'll be involved for quite a while, raising children, supporting my family. I'm struggling now with how to balance my worldly activities with my keenness to apply the principles of Advaita Vedanta and vairagya and moving away from worldly thoughts. I still need to think of investing money, even though I'm losing interest in earning it. That's that's good. I'm not so interested in earning money, but I need it. That's a pretty common problem. I feel like I'm not able to progress at pace with applying these teachings. And this is such a common problem that because we live complicated lives, and the vast majority of people have so many responsibilities, and yet if you are really devoted to following these teachings of Advaita Vedanta, you come very quickly to what seems to be a brick wall. And the brick wall is, Vedanta tells you that no amount of worldly activities, no worldly activity, no worldly effort can ever bring you perfect peace and contentment, which is what you want. So that's a basis for vairagya. At the same time, you have these responsibilities, family, etc. So how to manage the value, how to manage vairagya, let me put it in these terms. How to manage vairagya, dispassion. By the way, this dispassion is, I don't want to get in, I'm editing myself, pardon me. So, how to manage this vairagya, this dispassion towards worldly activities because they will never lead to perfect contentment. How to manage that with your responsibilities of day-to-day life. How to simultaneously practice both. Obviously you can't, right? You're either engaged in worldly activities or you're not. Is there a middle ground? I mean, definitely you can simplify your worldly activities as much as possible, and that's probably a good thing to do. Why be unnecessarily engaged in certain complexities? Make it simple. But even if it's simple, you're still engaged in worldly activities. Or if you want, go to Rishikesh, find someone to throw you in a Ganga and take you, I'm making a joke out of this, throw you in a Ganga, take you out, wrap you up in this cloth, and send you on your way. This is my facetious description of sannyasa, in which case you are now completely withdrawn from worldly activities. It's one or the other. There's no middle ground. You are either engaged in the world or you're not. If you're not engaged in the world, then studying Vedanta becomes pretty easy. No problem. If you are engaged in the world, you need something more. I heard someone call, there's some expression in American English, maybe you'll get it better than I. They call it something special that they need, that you need. They'll call it a special sauce. What a funny metaphor. I don't know. I'm not a cook. Maybe that's why I don't get the metaphor. Special sauce is an American idiom which apparently means some special factor that you need to make it work. And a special sauce that is needed by not just by Rajiv, but by the vast majority of spiritual seekers. The spiritual sauce is called karma yoga. That's it. The special sauce is karma yoga. How to be engaged in worldly life and simultaneously, in fact, he says, progress at pace. How to be engaged in the world and still progress on your path of spiritual growth. In one word, karma yoga. By the way, in Sanskrit, karma yoga is one word. So, karma yoga is a solution how to transform ordinary worldly activities into spiritual practice. The one-word answer is karma yoga. If you're not clear about how karma yoga converts ordinary activities into spiritual practice, my video is helpful, The Secret of Karma Yoga. You'll find it on my YouTube channel. This would be a good place to conclude for today. Nice questions. Om sarve bhavantu sukhinaha sarve santu niramayaha sarve bhadrani pashyantu ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet asato ma satgamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityor ma amritangamaya. Om shanti shanti shanti. Om Tat Sat. See you next time.